Hello, everybody. Looking today again at Walthers' pastoral theology, moving a little bit on from sort of um, what is this idea of pastoral theology and what is this idea of the regular call? We did speak about that. But now moving on from sort of like what is this regular call? Walther then moves on in chapter 5 to a discussion of what constitutes a valid and legitimate call to the pastoral office. Now, I think that this is becoming as well a sort of controversial issue in our sort of you know the term like Christendom, let's call it like a Lutherdom. And the reason that this is because I have friends, many of us, we do have friends in synods that do the call differently. For example, just a small sort of example. When I began my pastoral ministry, I began that pastoral ministry in the Canadian Association of Lutheran Congregations, which, in full fellowship with the Lutheran Congregations in Mission for Christ, and very similar to it, did I guess you could say um, we want to be careful here because of the definitions of things, but they would begin calls, as it were, as they would understand it, with an interim sort of temporary office. This idea that your congregation is going to vote to call a pastor, but that's going to be on a temporary basis to sort of probationarily try that pastor out. And then if they feel it's a good fit, then they will make that call permanent. Now, there is a discussion in this very book, which says that that is not a valid call because it is not on a permanent basis. Um, and so, I guess like the question is that a valid call? Is something that's controversial. Now, another situation that's sort of arising as well. Obviously, I mean, we all know about, for example, the calling of female pastors being controversial, or pastors who have been disbarred from office. Obviously, that's controversial for good reason, but there's other things that I think people are starting to think of a little bit more now with some synods, which are they could be classified, I suppose, as micro synods, where pastors are called not to a congregation and not by a congregation, but by a pastor to go and create a congregation, such as, we might say it's a missionary call. Or, for example, we would see synods like the ELCA calling pastors as public theologians. A lot of these sort of questions arise when we try and sort of presume an oversimplification of the situation and say a call to the pastoral office is a call from a congregation to a congregation. That's very North American, but it's very North American 1800s Missouri Synod. It doesn't really um, take into account the things which are taking place right now and which are being called and functioning as calls. And they also don't pick up on some of the more modern controversies that we're dealing with, even in, for example, synods like Missouri Synod and its global partners around the world, which are starting to question as to whether, for example, the synod presidency is a call and what that would mean. Whether it is or isn't, obviously it's a contentious issue. I don't think these things should be contentious issues, but we're not really here to talk about my opinions. We're here to talk about Walther's opinions. And I think in this chapter, you'll probably encounter this sort of dichotomy between my opinions and Walther's opinions. And I guess I'll just hold mine and let him speak. So he begins chapter 5 saying this question that we're asking here is not what the office is, but what constitutes a valid, legitimate call to that office. And he says it is valid and therefore legitimate if it's extended by those who have the right and authority from God to do so. Now, as he's discussed elsewhere, and he says at the beginning of comment 1, the validity of a call depends on those who have the right to extend that and the authority from God to do that. And then he says, it is every Christian local congregation that has this right and this authority from God. And he says, as he said before, he has said that before. So, what does this mean? Well, it means a couple things, right? When we're looking at a valid call, this idea of, extending it from those who have the right and authority to do so. This reminds us that this call is not understood as the church's call, but God's call, right? And God utilizing this calling body, which in Walther's case, he's talking about the local congregation, is the way in which God calls us. So I had a conversation recently in which somebody said, they don't like this other church body, which is saying that they have a direct call from God, and then they asked them how that call from God took place, and they said basically through the church. Now, it's not a Lutheran church, it's not our church. So whether I would even consider it a church, I think the answer is probably no. Um, but this gentleman took issue with the idea of a call from God taking place through human beings, through an ecclesial body. Um, and I said to him, he was thinking, and we don't say that. And I said to him, we do say that. Actually, we say that exact thing of, in fact, every single pastor in a congregation, that he is called by God, not immediately, that is without means, and some will say not directly, right? And that's I guess it's a fitting word, I suppose, but through the church. And so when we talk about a pastor, we talk about a pastor who's called by God through the church, as such as therefore not saying that the pastor is called by the church in a way that he's not called by God, right? As though he's called by God by the church apart from God. As though it was totally this task of the church itself, which holds this authority, God, which has no place here. This kind of idea, though we can say like the church called and God did not call, or the church called without God. And so we also don't say God called and the church didn't call. God called apart from the church, or God called without the church. Now, our confessions and our theologians do talk about this call, which is called an immediate call, right? But this immediate extraordinary call is the call of prophets, which is not the call that we talk about when we talk about pastors, right? That's that internal sort of immediate call in which for example, Isaiah gets in the beginning of the book of Isaiah, or Ezekiel gets, right? This is not what the pastor is saying. When the pastor is saying, he wakes up and he doesn't say, God called me in a dream or something. And this is talked about, for example, in Augsburg 14 and Luther's works, which deal with sort of that topic of Augsburg 14, where we're talking about only those who are rightly, regularly called to the office of public ministry should be teaching, preaching, administering the sacraments. And when Luther's talking about this, and when the confessions are talking about this, bringing this up, it's these like Schwärmerei, as they call them, these enthusiasts who were heretical, basically, proto-Pentecostals, running around calling themselves prophets. And saying that God had called them immediately without the church, and that they were going to, for example, go in and take the service, and that they had a word from the congregation. And I've even dealt with this myself, right? I've had people walk into, St. Matthew's Lutheran Cornwall, and they've said, sorry, I need to stop the Bible study, or I need to stop the service. I have a word from God. And, no, you don't have a word from God. But that's not even if you did. The point is, even if you did have the word from God, this congregation is not for this immediate, personal, independent sort of idea of message. But this is the place for the public ministry of the public church, in which the person preaching and administering the sacraments has been rightly, regularly, orderly, publicly called to that ministry. Now, therefore, when we talk about the pastoral ministry, we're talking about one who's called by God through the church in that public sense. And with all of that comes, it comes another sort of point of contention and careful concern, as it were. This question of, well, what then is the efficient means to make this call valid? And we want to be careful here and say, this is not the saying, this is what ordains somebody efficiently, such that the call without the laying on of hands ordains the person, and the ordination is unnecessary and the installation is unnecessary. That would be to overstate the case that Walthers making here. And I'm sure someone else will want to make that case elsewhere. It's not going to be me, but I'm sure somebody could try and make that, and I'm sure they have. But what Walthers saying here is the thing that makes that call valid is not the hands, such that the laying on of hands could exist without the call of the calling body, which he says is the congregation having this sort of right and authority from God to do. And you couldn't say, for example, with these microsynod types, well, that individual pastor called me, whatever that means, and then to go and create a congregation. He laid hands, but there is no congregation in Walther's sense that has called. Therefore, there's no legitimate sort of call to that ordination. In the same way, we wouldn't say, for example, at least Walther's not saying. I'm sure I would say it. To me, it would be, considered more careful if we said something like, for example, the call in the calling body, such as the congregation, is the inauguration of the office's bestowal, but that the laying on of hands from an ordained pastor is the sort of consummative, the efficient consummation of the office's bestowal on that person together with the installation. But that's not what Walther is saying. What Walther is saying is that the call itself is the efficient means of the office's bestowal on this officer. Again, not he's not. We don't want to overstate the case and say, for example, as and some synods do say this, that once called, apart from the laying on of hands, you are ordained. I don't think we should go that far. But Walther is saying the thing which makes the call valid, in this sense, like a valid office to be called into for that person, is the call itself, not the laying on of hands. And a very interesting sort of thing with this is he actually wraps up the authority to do all those things into one, which I don't think is a correct move. But I think it's a valid move, like sort of theologically, logically, even interpretively, though not really in the sense of, for example, like how you would say, um, biblically in the pattern that's given. And I want to be careful with that, right? And this does get into sort of some things that we were talking about with like just in the past previous episode on the Augsburg Article 28 on the power of bishops with this sort of hermeneutical exegetical tradition in which the example of the apostles is not considered divine in its sort of authority, but as an example. So not as a prescription, but as a description. I don't I think that sometimes that can be helpful, sometimes that can be a little bit confusing for people. However, Walther's move here is to say that wrapped up in the authority to call with the congregation is also, he says, the right and authority to judge all doctrine and to call, install, and depose teachers. And you'll have to note here, he makes no mention here in this sentence of synodical authority, of other pastors, of oversight, nothing like that. So there's no mention of a bishop, and Walther is understanding the pastor as the bishop. So his understanding here is a very bottom up sort of, or would you say bottom up? Yeah, I guess bottom heavy even theology of ecclesiology. And this is probably why in many ways a lot of Lutherans, especially those not in Missouri Synod, do not like Walther's ecclesiology, because Walther's ecclesiology, while it does sort of have a sense of submission and authority, it's flipped on its head from the picture of the early church and obviously the medieval church. And I would even say, and of course, this is where we get into debate. And there is a book sitting across from me, and I can't even read the title. Maybe I'll pause it and I'll go and show it to you, just because I think if I can figure out how to pause this dang thing, because I think it would be helpful for us to all sort of see yeah, I'll pause this. Hold on. Okay, so the book here is called Government in Missouri Synod. I know that obviously the cameras, at least from my end, it looks backwards. I don't know if you're going to see it right, but it's by Carl S. Mundinger. And in this, there's several obviously there's several chapters here, but there's several relevant chapters here. So in the sort of first one where he's talking about Luther's concept of church government, he talks about how the Walther in particular had spent tons of time just poring over Luther and trying to basically distill his own sort of ecclesiology down to a mirroring sort of repristination of Luther's own ecclesiology. Whether or not he did that, I guess, is the debate. But there are several texts from Luther here that are cited that I do think actually work very much in Walther's favor. And that's not even to say that those should be read that way, or even that Walther's opinions in every regard here are true. Um, do be careful in hearing me every regard. That doesn't mean in any regard. I do think that Walther is correct in many ways. But he brings up here this obviously I can't remember if we've done a series on Luther's letter to the Christian nobility, but in that letter to the Christian nobility, this is kind of where that sort of argument of Luther that it's not the ecclesiastical authorities in the body of the church that are to be calling, such as a pope or bishops, cardinals, even a presbyterial board that's to be calling necessarily. However, the reason given for that, both in the Augustana's Apology, as well as in Luther's own works, in and outside of the Book of Concord, and Walther cites one of Luther's here in the Small Called Articles, talks about the reason for bringing in other things here is not absolute necessity, such to say that a call not done by the congregation alone is invalid, right? And if that's the case, many of the church fathers' calls would be invalid because that's not actually the way that all church fathers have been called. And this, for example, if you look at, for example, the Oriental Orthodox Church, that is how their calls were done. However, if you look at, for example, another church body such as Rome, that is how their calls have been done, right? Um, there's discrepancy in modern times and in past times. So, now, as to Walther's sort of point here, and maybe we'll pause after this, just because I have a visitor that's just arrived here. But Schmal called articles where the church is, the command is there to preach the gospel. Therefore, the church must retain the authority to promote, elect, and ordain ministers of the church. And such authority is a gift which has been given to the church and cannot be received by human authority as the church, as St. Paul testifies when he says he ascended up on high and gave gifts to men, and therefore it's to the church that the keys are given to the whole church, not to some special persons. But again, you bring back that actual text of um, the letter to the Christian nobility. Um, did he not incite literal special persons, such as the ruling class, to take on this job, this task of calling pastors? And such was done, for example, in Germany for a long time, where the calling body was not the church and it was not the congregation in the sense of the church. It was quite literally like the kings, the rulers of the area. So maybe we'll try and finish this, at least the first comment here. Um, this idea of the keys given to the whole church, not to some special persons. Well, this is true also of not just the calling of pastors, but word and sacrament. And what Luther means there is not that, on one Sunday Bob's going to preach, on, the next Sunday Stephanie's going to preach, nothing like this. But that certain particular people, while the church has all the keys, certain particular men are elected, called, ordained, installed to go and do that. Now, what he means by this sort of earlier thing, at least what Walther means by this earlier thing, saying the congregation has the authority, the right um, to call, to install, to depose teachers. This is drawn from Luther, and I actually don't even know what the shorthand citation of this is. But just to say, again, he's trying to do is just distill his theology until it mirrors a total repristination of Luther's own thought. So he's not trying to do his own thing. He was trying to do Luther's thing. So this idea then, um, of congregations having it within themselves, this power, this right, this authority to do all of that, to not just call, um, but to ordain, install, judge doctrine, and depose. It not only what it does is it kind of makes the congregation independent of the clergy. Um, Not in a necessary sense, but in a possible sense. And I think that's probably an important distinction to make because while it may seem like Walther is kind of leading in this direction, by the way, beautiful stuff in this book. There's a couple chapters on how Walther sort of kept the Missouri Synod from slipping into an even more radically congregationalist sort of stance by sort of trying to temper this this ability, not ability, but the sort of drift into what is possible must be what is necessary in the most minimalistic sense of having any kind of ecclesiastical oversight, such that Walther is not saying you should not have a pastor to lay hands at the ordination or a pastor present at the installation. Those things are assumed, but the idea is the right that the how would you say the right and the ability to do that belongs to the whole congregation, even though it's exercised by an individual, which is why some of this language of the Schmalkald articles can be easy to misunderstand when Luther's saying the keys are given to the whole church, not to a special individual. It's true, but they're exercised by a special individual, right? And in the same way, the right of calling has been given to the whole church. Yet in the letter to the Christian nobility, Luther is suggesting that a special individual, the prince, the secular leaders of the governing world, exercise that authority that the whole church has. In the same way, also, the church has the authority to depose, yet that letter of deposal is going to be written by an individual and carried out by probably the president of the congregation. Now, on that sort of note of the judging of doctrine, this does sort of run up against some of the earlier chapters in which Walther was speaking to us on the matter of the divine nature of the call being a thing we can rest in and submit to. Well, if we are judging the doctrine, it's very difficult to submit to. And I don't want to say that this is something that should be seen as a contradiction, but that there is a sort of tension here, which gets worked out or is attempted to be worked out by Walther as he continues his work. So again, trying to finish first comment here. Luther writes, um, um, speaking of the keys here, should we now be a holy Christian church and have the greatest and most necessary things as God's word, Christ, Spirit, faith, prayer, baptism, the sacrament, keys, the pastoral office, etc., and should not have also the minor things, namely the authority and right to call some persons to the office to administer to us the word, baptism, sacrament, forgiveness, absolution, which are already there, and to serve in these things? Now, this is something that in the Book of Concord, you'll note that our confessions state like against Rome, which is viewing what we call the major things, right? Prayer, baptism, faith, sacraments as the major things, sorry, the minor things that are couched within, they think, the major thing of the priestly office. Well, really, the episcopal office in which the priestly office is couched. Where the Book of Concord states that instead of having the means of grace flowing, not flowing from, but existing within and because of the pastoral office exists for the purpose of these major things. Okay, now, Walther brings up this letter to the Christian nobility, but he does it in a different sort of way, right? He's sort of emphasizing that this is not a clerical thing, but that it's a sort of, if you will, a universal thing. But again, we need to be careful to understand that there is still an effective uh, um, uh, economic use by a special individual, a particular person or persons, such as a church council, that's going to undertake the task of the many in this sense, which is the same thing that a king is, or a president, a prime minister, not only of a congregation, but also of a whole country. Um, and so also of, a whole church, right? So, okay, these common rights and authorities of all Christians, then, he says, are exercised, as I'm saying, by the individual. Yet, the point of this comment one is to say the right belongs to the common people. And so when he talks about like what gives this right, it's the right of the whole congregation. Um, and this is a sort of thing that's used against Rome when Rome is saying these are invalid calls, which I think is probably the best use of Walther's thought here and Luther's thought here. Um, Not to say, I think probably the worst use of it would be to say you have this idea of a let's just do the bare minimum ecclesiastical oversight and view it as necessary just because it's possible. That would be probably the worst use of Walther that I could imagine, or a congregation saying, the pastor bends to us because we are the ones who get to judge the not only the doctrine but the practice. We get to call, we get to install, we get to ordain. No pastors present at the installation, no pastors present at the ordination. It's all just laity, laying hands, laity, praying over. And you'll see this stuff liturgically. You will see this stuff, right, at an installation where you have the church council laying hands together with the pastor. But the worst, probably worst use of Walther's thought here, of Luther's thought here, would be to have pastors not present, not invited, not allowed to lay hands. Obviously, you will see them doing it together with laity. I don't think that's liturgically helpful. Um, but I think the best use of it is to approach these Roman Catholics and these Eastern Orthodox folks who say you guys are not legitimately called, to push back and say the legitimacy of the call to this office is on the basis of the congregation's right to call, not upon the bishop's right to call, apart from the church or independent of the church. And so when we bring this into Lutherdom again, and we say, well, where's the main controversy here? The main controversy is probably going to be with those microsynodal practices of having a pastor ordain, will call and ordain another pastor without a congregation in referent. And I don't mean particularly in the sense of like the ELCA public theologian, because there is historical witness to that. But I think, especially in the case of missional contexts, so what I would probably suggest here, not Walther, but myself, would probably be something like have a congregation as part of that call toward the mission, right? So, for example, you're called by St. John's Lutheran Church in somewhere to be a missionary, which will either be like, what's the sense? What's the word? Local. What is the word for that? I forget. Or international, domestic. That's right. A domestic missionary doing the work locally or going out somewhere else to do that work elsewhere. So I think that would be probably more helpful. And I think that would be, I don't even want to say necessary. I'm just saying that would be best. And that would be best because then you have a connection between the call to the object of that mission, which is the people group, and a congregation that is sending that out, right? Now, I don't think that it's wrong to say where you're going to have a synod do that, and therefore, I think it's probably best to draw together the congregation, the synod, the ecclesiastical officers. Again, this is just comment one, and these are just some of my own sort of comments on comment one. So, as we keep going through comment one, we'll see some more of what Walther's thinking, and I guess also what Luther's thinking, and looking at sort of, well, how can we integrate this, if at all, into the way that we sort of think and work and live. And perhaps, when we get back together, maybe we can bring in some more stuff from this book from Carl S. Mundinger, because I think that he does a really good job of, thinking through Walther's pastoral theology and some other sort of thoughts that were going on in the early Missouri Synod about these ecclesiastical issues. Alrighty.